But Carl, the floor is yours.
Okay, great, super. Yeah, well, I wanted to welcome you actually from my virtual perch in the newly named Lafayette Pointer Park and Recreation Center. I hope you all have a chance to visit it soon. Tonight, Historic Chevy Chase, DC is pleased to offer the first of 3 events that we hope will inform the planning process in which our community is engaged today. The intention is to facilitate meaningful participation by providing perspective and context. The Planning Our Future series is designed to look at our collective past as a way of understanding the current situation. Historic Chevy Chase DC's contribution is meant to frame the discussion in terms of how Chevy Chase relates to the rest of the city and its near abroad, hoping to foster a vision in which the interests we defend are defined by the values we hold as we make use of the opportunities provided by the small area plan. We start tonight by revisiting the Macmillan process. That's tonight. On May 19th, Historic Chevy Chase DC's second Zoominar will focus on the mechanisms that produce the racial geography we are living with today. Architect, historian, and journalist Neil Flanagan will be joining us for that event. Our third Wednesday evening event is scheduled for June 9th. It will be a panel examining proffered solutions to the affordable housing need, focusing on Ward 3 and Chevy Chase particularly. We hope that you'll join us for all 3 events. Now, the DC we inhabit today was in important ways created between 1890 and 1910. The city was pushing out beyond Boundary Street, that's Florida Avenue. As the population grew, developers were busy creating new housing in an urban landscape defined in part by Jim Crow racism. Chevy Chase was part of the movement that also produced LaDroit Park and Columbia Heights. Space was racialized as the key components of DC were defined. That includes Rock Creek Park. This was happening as a second refounding was underway. As is well known, the nation's foundational planner, Peter L'Enfant, was given carte blanche to project a detailed version of the Capitol that the first Congress voted into existence. Despite the post-Civil War modernization projects undertaken by Boss Shepard, with the passage of a century, L'Enfant's Federal City had lost its earlier visual charm and faced issues common to a rapidly urbanizing society. A pivotal response reflected the role of Congress in governing DC. The Republican senator from Michigan, James Macmillan, initiated an episode of planning in the mid-1890s. It is that initiative that we are gathered to discuss tonight. Among the issues to be addressed this evening are: what was the Macmillan planning process? How did it originate? Who did it include and who did it exclude? What did the plan foresee? How much of the plan was implemented? What impact did the whole process have on the city? What was its impact? In particular, how was the process and outcome affected by race politics? And what did the experience teach us about the desirability of planning itself? Now, to lead our discussion this evening, we are very fortunate indeed to have with us Tom Lewis, emeritus professor at Skidmore College and author of the acclaimed Washington, A History of Our National City, which was published in 2015. Ken Burns called this book, I quote, a vivid example of the best kind of history. Now, as we focus on the myriad details involved in planning, it is a special strength to have the perspective of a person engaged with our city as an outside observer. We are asking Professor Lewis to contextualize the task before us today with a big picture reminder of where we have been before. Prior to Professor Lewis's book, the most recent general history of DC was nearly 50 years old. When I heard his book presentation at the Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital, part of the Overbeck Capitol Hill History Project, I was most impressed by Tom's ability to connect the very disparate experience of Washingtonians while crafting a narrative that paints a compelling, multifaceted portrait of our city. For our purposes, I found chapters 9, 10, and 11 particularly relevant. And you must go out and buy this book. It is a wonderful read. The chapters tell the story. The chapter titles are L'Enfant Redivivus, Washington's Apartheid and the End of Innocence, and Normalcy and Neglect. Just a word on format. I've asked Professor Lewis to address the questions I mentioned, taking 20 or 30 minutes, leaving ample time for him to respond to your questions. Please use the chat function for this purpose. Chaz Cadwell, who you already heard from, and who is also technical producer tonight, will read them out for Professor Lewis's response, maybe after an introductory question on my part, and we'll adjourn promptly at 8:30. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carl, for a generous introduction. I want to say to all of you that before I accepted this invitation to speak tonight, I actually checked your website of HCCDC, and what I found was a vigorous organization, an organization with a lot of energy. You've been in business for 30 years, 1991. In 1991, I was reminded that Sharon Pratt Dixon became the mayor. There was an austere budget that might have saved the city's bond rating. The population of Washington had declined to about $606,000. 606,000 people. Now, your work as part of HCCDC actually sort of follows the upward trajectory of the city since that time. And I think the success of a city is measured by the engagement of all its citizens. Buildings are important, streets and sanitation and things like that are important, but it's the engagement of citizens that means the most. And HCCDC really fosters that engagement. I was also pleased to see that James Fisher is a member of your board. And of course, he's a descendant of George Pointer, about which I'll just say a few words at the end. Now, I've been asked to help kick off this planning for our future by lending some historical context for the discussion. And to speak about the Macmillan Plan, I'm going to do that and talk about how it pertains to Francis Newland's Chevy Chase, the issue of racism, which of course was built into Chevy Chase, and the idea of planning itself. Now, let's start by talking about Senator McMillan. James McMillan from Michigan was born in 1838. He was a senator of considerable Republican repute at a time when the Republicans were, for the most part, very much in control of the Congress. He had built a railway. He was interested in shipping. He built a railway to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which joined the Upper Peninsula basically with the rest of Michigan. He had been very much a fostering civic pride in his city of Detroit. He was on banking boards and did civic good works, including helping to create the really magnificent Detroit Museum of Fine Art, and also the Park Commission, on which he sat as chairman. So he was rock solid Republican, and he was also, as a Republican, had no time for social or political progressives whatsoever. But since he controlled the Republican Party completely, he decided that he'd buy his way into the Senate, which he did in 1889, and moved to Washington then, and stayed there until he died in 1902. He headed the District of Columbia Committee and was known jocularly as the mayor of Washington. Now, the reason behind James McMillan's success is actually a man named Charles Moore, that indispensable aide to a senator. All successful senators have a great aide behind them. Moore was quiet, urbane, beautifully educated at Phillips Academy and also at Harvard, and basically a beautifully smooth, beautifully turned out and smooth individual. Now, Moore forged an alliance between, this was in 1900, forged an alliance between the American Institute of Architects and Macmillan himself and his District of Columbia Committee. And with remarkable sleight of hand, which Moore was brilliant at achieving, he created a plan for improvement of the park system of the District of Columbia. And that was something that was very important for the district. It gave him, Macmillan, money to create a committee that would explore changing the park system and improving it. But it was really about, if you consider the park system, changing and finding again L'Enfant's plan for Washington. The committee that Macmillan appointed consisted of Daniel Burnham, from the author and creator of The White City, the Columbian Exposition of 1893, Charles McKim, the society architect, head of McKim, Mead and Waite in New York City. He'd worked with Burnham and knew him well. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who was the son of Frederick Law Olmsted, the great architect, and he was also appointed really as sort of an addition of very old Augustus St. Gaudens, the great sculptor. Now, the group decided to tour Europe. They went to all the capitals, important capitals in Europe: London, Paris, Rome, Vienna, and took in not the sites, but exact measurements of how the parks and how the land was organized. But something else happened in Europe, and that was the meeting between Charles Cassatt, the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Daniel Burnham. And I'm sure you all know that, but to remind you that the Baltimore and Ohio terminal was right underneath the Capitol at this point, or right on the mall underneath the Capitol. It was at that Baltimore and Ohio terminal where James Garfield was shot. So it was obviously something that shouldn't be on the mall. What happened was they arranged, Cassatt and Burnham arranged that Cassatt, who had recently purchased the Baltimore and Ohio, would remove the terminal, build a new station, and in exchange for Congress basically drilling a tunnel under Capitol Hill to take the trains into the South. And it worked. So in January 15, 1902, a great exhibition of the plans for the improvement of the park system was unveiled at the Corcoran Art Museum and the Corcoran Gallery, I should say. And interestingly enough, L'Enfant's plan was the keystone of the exhibit. That is to say, it was found again, and which had been more or less forgotten, and revived and brought into what was now the 20th century. The return to L'Enfant's plan meant that there would be a great mall. It would have a Lincoln Memorial, basically where it is. It called for a Jefferson Memorial, where it is, not the name Jefferson, but just a memorial there. And it restored, as well as it possibly could, some of the mistakes that had been made on the mall. Most especially the Washington Monument, which is off axis with the Capitol and with the White House. But clever tree plantings managed today to trick the eye. Now, we got to put into context the Macmillan Plan, turning to that for a moment and put it and make a connection to Chevy Chase. We have to remind ourselves of the United States in 1901, 110 years ago. It was a very different place. The population in the United States was 76 million. They were spread across 45 states. The city population of Washington was 331,000. There was no Panama Canal, remember, but there was the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which had been signed just as Teddy Roosevelt became president, that would enable him to create one. Teddy Roosevelt was beginning at that time to move on antitrust laws to, as he said, make corporations subserve to the public good. And one other thing that I think is minor, but also important for this discussion, Booker T. Washington was invited by Teddy Roosevelt to dine with him at the White House. That, of course, raised enormous, virulent reaction in the South, across the South, and violent too. No other African-American was invited to dine at the White House after that in the Roosevelt administration. Now, at the same time that the Macmillan Plan was coming on, Francis Newlands was working to build Chevy Chase. Now, Francis Newland, just a bit about him, I'll probably remind you of some things. His life was a testament to hard work, great good luck, and a fortuitous marriage to the daughter of a silver baron from Nevada. Now, he had a hard scrabble life at the beginning, and which began in Natchez, Mississippi. His mother was a social climber, and his father was sadly an alcoholic surgeon who died very young. Mother set off for Quincy, Illinois, and married the mayor of Quincy, who was also a banker. So they had now good times. But unfortunately, the mayor's luck ran out in 1857, in the Panic of 1857. But he then went on to Washington and took his family there. Newlands had the ability to meet with all the right people. He ended up at Yale for a while, and then also at the Columbian Law School, now George Washington, and then took himself to San Francisco, became a lawyer there, established a law practice, married the daughter of the richest man in the city, and one of the richest in the West. And he ultimately ends up in Nevada doing land deals and decides to become a congressman in 1893 and later becomes a senator in 1903. Now, the importance of Newlands is that he created the Reclamation Act of 1902, which essentially opened up the West for irrigation of desert lands. It was something that broke the prevailing wisdom and myth that private enterprise and individuals could fund great projects. In this case, the irrigation of, which was a huge project. But of course, we know from, and everyone knows from bitter experience, that Newlands was a virulent white supremacist. And Chevy Chase was one of his land deals. He had another, interestingly enough, in Reno, Nevada. And both of those land deals, right now, it's interesting that the citizens of those communities are working to have his name removed from plaques and fountains and the like. This then leads us to consider the racial politics. And I want to turn to the Union Station for a moment. And that's an example of what was going on. The Union Station was built in a place that's called Swamp Poodle. It was basically a swamp, and then it was also a pool, and they put the two words together and made a joke and called it Swamp Poodle. It was inhabited largely by Irish American workers who basically built a lot of Washington, D.C. But no matter, just wipe out 300 houses, displace 1,700 people, give them very little compensation, and build the magnificent station that stands there today. Now, Newlands dies in 1917, but Woodrow Wilson, of course, became president in 1913. And basically, by the end of 1913, Jim Crow laws were in full force, not only in Washington, but around the country. I actually think that Woodrow Wilson and the suppression of African Americans is one of the most awful stains on American history that there is. Whenever I see a place like, and read a story like the one of George Pointer, I see the face of Woodrow Wilson. Whenever I think of how he really continued an apartheid in the United States that should never have been in the first place, and actually made it worse for generations, I think I feel ashamed. Now, the last part of my talk this evening is about planning, what I've called planning and its discontents, because it's a play, of course, on Freud's Civilization and its discontents. And you'll remember in Civilization and its discontents, Freud talked about the individual having an uneasy relationship at times with civilization. And I think we as individuals very often, including myself, have an uneasy relationship with planners. Planners, however, have we hope changed. Now, Olmsted Jr. Worked with his father on the Emerald Necklace in that surround the Emerald Necklace of parks that surround Boston. And for those parks, they took over and kicked out farmers, destroyed farmhouses, leveled the land, did magnificent plantings, which we all enjoy today who go to those parks. And who of us hasn't walked in Central Park in New York City? Planned 843 planned acres, which was completed in 1876. There were 34,000 lots in that park area. There were 1,600 African-American and Irish residents living there in little communities dotted across the park. They were evicted, their land, their property was raised, and they were given very little compensation for it. So I want to end on thinking that context, which I've tried to give, don't mistake it as a what should I say, an excuse, or in any way an apology for the errors, the indignities, the injustices of the past. With new understanding that we acquire with each generation, we should recognize and account for those errors and do so in the way we act both in the present and in the future. Planners live in utopias. They are necessarily dreamers, and they look for things, for doing things right, but they have to be reminded occasionally that the planning has an important human dimension that can't be forgotten. So with that, I'll end my remarks and turn it back to Carl and ask for his thoughts.
Yeah, hi, Tom.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate the job you were able to do in a very limited amount of time and cover so much territory. While people are thinking of questions to ask you, I just wanted to ask something very basic. You're sitting in Saratoga Springs, community I know well from having lived there once myself, as we discussed before. What is it that motivated you to write this book?
Well, I grew up in Philadelphia, and I've been going to Washington, D.C. Ever since I was a child. In fact, I had relatives in the South, and I was a sort of child who was put on a train in Philadelphia with a tag on my sweater and carrying a bag too. And very lovely conductors would make sure that I changed in Washington to a train bound for Richmond. And so I was always going to Washington that way. I often stopped in Washington too, and later when I got older, and really starting about 1953 was the first time I have a great memory of the city itself, coming there. And then my parents would often drive through Washington, and we would stop there on the way to the South. So that was part of it. I was always intrigued by this city. And then later, when I was often in Washington on business, I would, of course, stay in a hotel, but then I would often take one of the red line or the blue line and go to a community and just walk the streets and have just remarkable times. And then finally, when I had just finished a book on and a film on the history of the interstate highway system, and I was actually in, and Washington had been a part of that history, of course. I was in Washington for an event, and I started to think about Constance Green's wonderful history of Washington, which was, I think, the one you were alluding to, which is quite out of date by this time, and still very, very readable, an eminently good sense historian, and decided, well, you know, there's a book in there, and I'd like to do it. And so I also feel there's a importance, so many people in Washington would disagree with this, of being fresh to the landscape, if you will, relatively fresh, to see the city maybe with eyes that haven't seen it as often as the eyes of a resident. And I also finally think Washington is our city. It's my city just as much as yours. It's meant to be that way. It is ultimately called the seat of government. And I think of it that way. But of course, it's beyond that. It's a city which has, don't forget, over 700,000 people in it now, but what, 715 or so. And if you think about it, that's right on the money, because L'Enfant actually designed the city, which he said would be about for about 700,000 people. And so it's a city of neighborhoods and delightful neighborhoods. And it's a city that I appreciate more and more. And when I wrote the book, I wrote it over about 7 years, and it gave me a great excuse to go to Washington and see it once again, every few weeks, really, and then stay for extended periods of time.
Well, you've been a fantastic ambassador for us, and we're much in your debt for that. I think Chaz is.
Sure, we've got one question in the chat so far, but I'll start with a question I have, Tom, and that is that you described how the citizens in Swamp Doodle got shoved aside, but you didn't talk much about whether the whole Macmillan effort was anything that engaged, where citizens for the rest of the city were engaged, or if the effort engaged them. Were there any local politics involved in this?
No, don't forget, Washington was run by 3 commissioners. There wasn't a mayor, there wasn't a council, there was 3 commissioners and one of those commissioners was always a person from the military. One of them was very often a Democrat and the other a Republican. And their allegiance to the city and their interest in the workings of the city were not especially great. In 1913, it was a sinecure for at least the 2 commissioners. The person who, and he was a guy, who had the control really was the fellow who from the Army, from the Army Corps of Engineers generally. He was the one who was really in charge. The other 2, by the way, they had, as I say, it was a sinecure. When a man named Brownlaw was appointed by Wilson, a carriage showed up at his door. And a man in livery was there, horse and carriage. He said, "I'm to take you to your office." And it turned out that they had, they had chauffeured, if you will, horse and carriage to take the commissioners around. So it was very much a different city. And this changed, by the way, by the time of the First World War. That really heated things up, and it didn't help at the same time that Washington also was in a pandemic, which is of course what we're in right now, but Washington was suffering grievously from the pandemic, the flu of 1918, so that they had their great problems there. But there was really no place, no voice for anybody to speak up and say, you're doing me an injustice. You couldn't go to anyone to get any help. In other words, you didn't have a local commissioner, a local council person you could go to.
So that at the same time that Senator Newlands was organizing the Chevy Chase Land Company, Macmillan was devising his Macmillan Plan, but the two were not really connected, or were they?
No, they weren't. First thing, Newlands was a congressman until 1903. Then he becomes a senator. Newlands was a kind of an unguided missile in a way. He had a reclamation plan that he put forth before in about 1901, I think, or 1900, and he presented it so offensively that it was voted down. He was not a well-liked person at that point. What happened was another reclamation plan by a congressman, I've forgotten his name, was put forth, and the congressman's wife got sick, so he had to leave it, and Newlands swept in, and Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted a reclamation plan, said, you tone down your voice, don't be abusive, and slip in all the language from your plan into this other congressman's, and that became the Newland Plan.
There's a question here in the chat, Tom, that suggests that we distinguish between the Macmillan Plan for the mall and then the 1930s construction of the Federal Triangle.
Yeah.
Suggesting that Macmillan had been interested in a sort of a comprehensive urban planning effort, mixing local and federal uses and scales, but the triangle was really just built simply it's an expression of the federal presence in Washington. What's your take on that?
Well, of course it is that, an expression of federal presence, writ large, I would say, too. But what had taken place was that a lot of the Federal Triangle was constructed both in the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, and government had changed, and Washington had changed again because of the First World War. Now, don't forget, the First World War had an enormous impact on the cityscape of Washington. That mall that Macmillan had and his committee had created was now had the great excrescences of the War Department intruding right into the mall itself. So it was and it was that way until about the Nixon administration. So I think that one of the things we need to account for is, yes, it was different from what Macmillan might have desired, but the times had changed, and the federal government was just burgeoning after the Second World War. And of course, then it grew exponentially in the second Roosevelt administration. So,
Tim Hannibal asked a question about the connection to, if you could talk a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson and the connection to Jim Crow, as you may or may not know, there's an effort now to rename Wilson High School here in Upper Northwest. But a related question to that, I guess, is about the role of these local racialized politics and national things. And so a question I had as well was why Roosevelt felt it useful to invite Booker T. Washington to the White House, because he must have known what reaction it would get. And the tide, including the later administration of Woodrow Wilson and the things going on in places like Chevy Chase, make it sort of make me wonder why Roosevelt felt that needed doing or was sensible to do.
Well, you have to remember, as someone said, the president is a little boy, has the age of a young boy. Somebody said he was a very impetuous man, Roosevelt. I'm sure he thought it would earn him some favor with those African Americans who could vote. So I think that's part of it. I'm not sure that he thought it through. See, and I'll just give you another example of Roosevelt's impetuosity. There was a man, and actually a very important man, Melville Dewey, who created something that's probably you've all grown up with, and that's the Dewey's Decimal System. And in 1906, this will be a quick story, Melville Dewey created, he was big on simplified spelling. In fact, his name was Melville, but he shortened it to Melville, so that so he was actually walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And he listed, oh, I've forgotten, I think it was, I want to say in the hundreds, words which should be spelled in a simplified way. Well, in the impetuous TR got a hold of this and declared that the federal government would henceforth engage in simplified spelling completely, no questions asked. That lasted until about, I think, maybe 6 weeks before Congress passed a bill with a rider on it, an essential bill with a rider on it that said no simplified spelling. So that's the kind of, I think it was very much the sort of man he was. And
we only have a few minutes left, and I want to save Barnaby's question for our last question. But maybe could you, going back to Macmillan and his being a senator, was there any connection to what he was doing here with his politics back in Michigan? What was the benefit for him of investing so much in this?
I've asked myself that question several times and reflected on it, and I came to the conclusion that there weren't any. That he was, James Macmillan was a really civic-minded person, and when he was in Detroit, he wanted to improve the circumstances of Detroit. He was instrumental in the park commission there. He chaired it. He was serious about his commitment to that. He didn't have to join the District of Columbia committee, but he did, and he loved it. And I think his engagement was not for any personal gain whatsoever. He did not make, he didn't, so far as I've ever found, he never made money on anything he did in the district. He didn't have a side deal, which enabled him to sell, I don't know, box cars or something that he was making in one of his plants in Michigan to somebody in the district. It wasn't that at all. He was just a genuinely decent politician. And that,
But at the same time, the planning that went on was more about the public space and the federal space than it was about Washington's growing toward Lone Font's goal of 700,000.
no, it wasn't. It was, and don't forget, it was the park. It was the park system.
Mhm.
So so what happened in the 20s is nearly as, and you probably can correct me on this, but what happened in the 20s is that by that time, they were taking parts of the Macmillan Plan, which, by the way, had been created by Moore and Moore and Olmsted. They created the park system, and so that they were moving forward on that plan. But what I tried to suggest is that planners are dreamers, and it's easy to say, you know, write in, this will be a park here, without considering the consequences, or this will be whatever. Architects do the same thing. And I don't think that those consequences had been thought through. And then you combine those plans with the racism, which was Newland's racism, and the Jim Crow ethos of Washington, and you've got a recipe for just walking over people whenever you wish, if you're so inclined, I'd say.
Sort of an unbenign neglect. When they
Yes.
when they made Rock Creek Park, were their neighborhoods displaced then as well, or?
Yes. Yes.
And who were those people? Do you have any sense of that?
They were more scattered, and I don't have any notion of what the ethnic makeup was.
So the other question that is here in the chat, and I don't know that you have a response to it, but that is what your thoughts are and what could be done today to build in equity and into the planning process, and to address what are pretty clearly not just neglect, but past injustices that shape the city the way it is today.
Well,
and in that respect, I'd be interested if there's any details you have about the Nevada community as well, that you said is confronting similar issues.
Yeah. Well, all I know about Reno, Nevada, though I've been there many, many times. I did actually, when I was working on the highway book, I often found myself in Reno. I think the thing is really you have to understand is that planning is a very quick process in the minds of planners, and it should be a very, very slow process that requires a great deal of listening in the minds of those who implement the plans. And it requires great flexibility to change those plans, to meet needs that might not have been thought of, to redress, if you will, great inequities that have been built in. So I mean, the renaming of a park is a small matter, and yet it's a great symbolic gesture, and it means something. And it helps to redress for the mistakes of the past. There are other things that unfortunately can't be redressed, but you have to be very careful. I would look at, believe it or not, I would look at the big dig in Massachusetts as a way of thinking. That was something which displaced and affected the lives of thousands and thousands of people. And yet they managed to do it. That is to take down the elevated highway and put it underground. It was rather like, as one person says, like performing heart surgery while playing tennis at the same time. It's so the city has to continue, and yet the road has to be built underground. And yet they did it in such a way that they listened to everybody. So it's going to take, whatever planning takes place requires patience and the understanding that people who come before planning boards really do have legitimate and serious concerns about how their lives might be affected.
Well, I have to say, scanning the names of people who are with us tonight, I think you've got lots of nodding heads if they were all visible. Carl, I don't have a bunch of other questions, but maybe you have some, or you want to wrap up.
Well, I think under the circumstances, we've covered so much territory. We've got many bon mots from you, Tom. There are lots of questions that, of course, could be asked, but the last two responses, I think, are pretty summarial in many respects. So what I would do, if that's okay, is say we've accomplished our purposes tonight, but I did want to close the session tonight by reminding everybody that we will reconvene on the 19th of May, another Wednesday night, and again on the 9th of June. And with that, I wanted to thank Tom really for sharing your perspective as someone who doesn't live amongst us, but has, like all of America, an interest in what we do here. And we very much appreciated hearing your wisdom, your stories, and I'm sure there'll be a stampede to the bookstore right after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.